Doctors of Reddit, what's the most incorrect patient self-diagnosis you've seen? Late to this, but my friend has an incredibly tough, alcoholic grandma. She ignored a stroke because she thought it was a hangover. Saw a patient last night who had been having episodes of wind for 6 months and had come in because of a particularly bad bout. Massive heart attack with crescendo angina over the preceding year. Not that uncommon a self-misdiagnosis, but kind of takes you aback when you see it. Not a doctor myself. My grandfather was a doctor and had a patient come to his office complaining of a slight headache. His receptionist told him to wait in the waiting room. They called his name, but the guy never came up to the desk. He actually suffered a major brain hemorrhage, died waiting to be seen in the chair. Man who rode his bike as sole method of transportation came in for chronic knee and leg pain. He had metastatic prostate cancer with bone lesions all over. Came in for my legs hurt, left with hospice referral. As a paramedic, I responded to a dispatch for a sick person. When we arrived, this old guy was clearly having a stroke. He said I just ate some bad fish or something before taking a 3-hour nap. Luckily his wife finally decided to call 911. I had a teenager and her mom come in worried she had some kind of serious circulation problem because her toes were blue. I looked at her feet and thought that's not really the right shade for loss of blood flow. I grabbed an alcohol swab and proceeded to wipe the blue color off the tops of her toes. I think it was from her new jeans. This thread is like reverse WebMD. Think it's cancer? You just stubbed your toe. Think you have a cold? 100% cancer. I personally knew a guy who was diagnosed with lung cancer in college at the age of 22. He was so young and lived a clean life, so it was confusing to everyone, even the doctors. They progressed very quickly with the treatment, and he was scheduled to start chemo. He was doing some sort of pre-diagnostic meeting, and an intern was involved. The intern started asking some very different questions, and he eventually asks the patient if he had been in Kansas recently. It turned out he had, in fact, spent the previous summer working in Kansas. This was a few weeks after. It turned out the intern had been writing a paper specifically about localized diseases, and there was this disease in Kansas that he had focused on. It had something to do with hay, but it wasn't hay fever. The intern was basically telling the doctor to humor him and run this one specific test. The doctor agrees, and the test comes back with results that show the intern was onto something. The patient went in for chemo treatments with a grim outlook, and he left with 10 pills he had to take over the next 5 days. 1 week later, he was completely fine. FWIW. This was in the year 2001. Not a doctor, but a psych first responder. Patient self-diagnosed as dead. EMTs didn't believe him. He was quite insistent though, and wanted an ambulance ride because he thought a dead person ought to have one. The EMTs argued with him, stating that he was both standing and talking. He countered that he was in hell. In fact, he was just pretty high with a bad drug combination. I had a fun hour with him while he came down. As a medic, I had a soldier run up to me and demand to see the PA. When I asked why, he said his girlfriend has BV and now has. Sure, he does too. I assured him that he most certainly did not have bacterial vaginosis. Edit to add a note, the soldier in question was symptom free, and we definitely still let the soldier see his provider. I'm not a doctor, but I'm a medical professional at a hospital. Patient came in stating that he had blood in his stool for almost a year and was convinced that it was just because of hemorrhoids. He only came in when he started to get abdominal pains. Turned out to be colorectal cancer. Moral of the story is, if you have blood in your stool, especially dark colored, don't ignore it. I have had an unbelievable amount of patients who think they have Stevens-Johnson syndrome thanks WebMD, when they in fact have contact dermatitis from new lotion or laundry soap. I also advise not looking up that condition. Edit, if you have recently started lamotrigine, carbamazepine, Bactrim, or allopurinol and develop a rash, definitely call your doctor. It may actually be SJS. Elderly man with dementia, brought in for suspicion of toxic epidermal necrolysis, a serious and life-threatening reaction where your skin peels off and sheets. Nope. It was a very large burn because they left grandpa alone at the house and he spilled a teapot on himself, and the family and another hospital were too dumb to figure it out. I was rushed to the ER as a kid because I woke up and my face was blue. Obviously my parents thought I wasn't breathing. I'm 8 or 9 years old and every own sudden change in demeanor is making me a little scared and I'm just getting bluer. At emerge, they're running all kinds of tests that aren't showing anything wrong with me until finally my dad realized that I'd put the brand new Toronto Maple Leafs pillowcase I just got on my pillow. Washcloth later, I was all better. He had some belly pain and thought he had a UT. Also had weight loss, night sweats and some other stuff. He had terminal pancreatic cancer and 2 weeks later he is delirious and at death's door. Not a doctor, but I'm a nurse. I recently had a patient who claimed that he used to have diabetes, but Jesus cured him of it. His glucose was nearly 300 on admission, and he was in the hospital for an amputation of a gangrenous toe that didn't heal because of said diabetes. He'll never forget the doctor's note that said patient had a history of diabetes, but states Jesus healed him of that. But since his blood glucose was 289 on admission, we will treat him as if he were a diabetic. I'm not a doctor, but I'm a medical assistant. I did my preceptor at a kidney and hypertension center. Had a guy come in complaining of painful urination and thought he had a UT. Gave him a cup and told him to pee and set it in the window. The lab took the cup and immediately brought him back to a room. Which was strange, BC this place stayed packed and it was all first come first serve kind of thing. Well, this guy went back, BC there was blood in his urine. A lot of it. This guy was beyond 300 pounds BTW. Just massive and extremely tall. Doctors got him in the room and stayed for maybe 15 minutes before we had him transferred to the ER. Apparently, he had a fractured penis and had no idea. The nurse above me said they lifted his gut and his entire groin was purple and black and his penis was at a weird, swollen angle. She said she'd never forget it for the rest of her life. The guy never did tell us what happened or anything. He acted just as surprised as everyone else. TLDR, UT turned out to be a broken deck. I would say after a couple years working in an emergency room before and during medical school, that by far the most common egregious self-misdiagnosis involved pregnancy. Tons of sexually active patients coming in complaining of morning sickness and gaining weight and just sure they have some sort of GI issue or infectious disease. When it comes around to asking questions, oh yeah, come to think about it, I haven't had my period in 3, 4, 5 months. That's not to mention the people coming in fully in labor and delivering in the ED, truly shocked that they were pregnant at all. Now I understand people can have irregular periods and there are many cases where the patient is reasonable in not guessing what's going on, but there is a large group of patients who missed a lot of obvious hints. Denial ain't just a river in Egypt, I guess, and I do have empathy for patients in situations where they really don't want to be pregnant, and so perhaps are subconsciously blocking it out of their mind. But a medical mystery it is not. I once thought I had a perforated colon because my poop was bright red. I spent an hour on the toilet in pain googling symptoms, and then I remembered I got high the night before and crushed a bag of flaming hot Cheetos. Okay, so why do you think you have glaucoma? Well, back in 02 I got shot right here and it was a Glock. I'm not creative enough to make this shoot up. I had a very nice gentleman come to the ED with severe weakness, going on 4 weeks. It all started with chest pain a couple of months earlier. He thought he was having heart trouble, and he knew you take aspirin for a heart attack. So he took a couple aspirin every day for the next few weeks. The pain got worse, and also started affecting his legs while walking. Then the weakness started. Then he pooped blood. A lot of it. That's what prompted the emergency department visit. When I checked his labs, his HGB was in the 4 range, which is low enough to make me raise my eyebrows. Normal is 13 to 15. You'll start feeling weak/tired around 10 usually. So his symptoms, including chest pain, weren't from heart trouble, they were from severe anemia. Turns out he had a small bleed from his colon, and taking aspirin, which thins your blood and makes you bleed more, turned it into a large bleed. So I get him tanked back up with blood. We do a few tests including a colonoscopy to see why he was bleeding in the first place. And whoops, we find locally advanced colon cancer. Thankfully it hadn't spread anywhere, so he eventually ends up getting surgery and chemo, and last I checked he's doing great. So this guy was incredibly lucky. By misdiagnosing himself with coronary artery disease, he took a totally inappropriate medication, which caused a side effect that set off a chain reaction that led him to me and his diagnosis with cancer at an early enough stage to be cured. If he hadn't taken that aspirin, that cancer could have sat another year or two undetected and continued to spread, at which point it would have been incurable and he'd likely be dead right now. When my husband was 8 years old, he complained about having intense pains in his stomach and became so lethargic that he couldn't be woken up. His doctor said there was nothing wrong and that he had growing pains for 2 years. It turns out his gallbladder had stopped working and would only function correctly a few days out of the month. After the doctor refused him a referral to another doctor for a second opinion, his mom took him to the emergency room, and within 15 minutes he was going into surgery to have his gallbladder removed. To top it off, they jam-packed him with so many pain meds that he became so constipated and he couldn't use the bathroom for 2 weeks. He complained about his stomach hurting again, and the nurses never once asked him when his last BM was, claiming that they forgot. He had to receive an additional surgery later that week in which he had 15 pounds of fecal matter removed from him. Talk about a shooty time. Not a doctor, but I did this to myself once. I was in high school, walking to class, when I got a sudden sharp pain in my foot. I was running late and didn't have time to deal with it right then, but I only really felt it while I was walking. It faded quickly when I was still, and even then it was minor enough that I figured it would go away on its own. After a couple of weeks of dealing with it, I mentioned it to my mom, who thought it might be gout. I was a really lazy kid, so it was a definite possibility. We go to the doctor and he does an x-ray, and it turns out I broke one of the bones in the ball of my foot. In short, I broke my foot and tried to walk it off for 2 weeks. I was in my work placement years when this happened. A man in his early 20s has committed a crime and claimed that he won't be going to jail because he self-diagnosed himself with personality disorder from Google search. Police officers brought him in for my mentor to diagnose him. My mentor exact word: "You do not suffer from personality disorder. You're just an asshole." I'm waiting for the day I could use the same line as my now retired mentor. Edit. My mentor did not diagnose him, by the way. He knew the guy was faking it, and all the police needed was a confirmation from a medical professional. Physician assistant that works in the emergency department here had a woman, around 45 years old, come in with her mother for a complaint of a spider bite to her back. It was actually an abscess. No big deal. That's pretty common. People think abscess is a spider bites all the time. I incised and drained it and sent her home on antibiotics. Pretty standard procedure. Told her to come back in 2 days for a check. When she came back it was looking better. She and her mother thought it was something serious because it still wasn't all the way gone yet, but it was healing well and there wasn't much to do. She and her mother came back again another 2 days later and told me it was definitely gangrene. I tried to reassure them, but they both kept arguing with me that I didn't know what I was talking about. It was obviously a healing abscess and was looking a lot better. Looked nothing like gangrene, which they had googled. Had to get 2 of my colleagues to come in the room to reassure them, but they still didn't believe us. Think they ended up going to another hospital. TLDR, woman came to the ER 3 times for an abscess she thought was gangrene. I may have told this one before. Morbidly obese lady terrified she had a lump in her breast. Demanded to be examined immediately. RIP. Mother brought in her 3rd child. Kid's listless, pale, muscle tone is poor. Mother claims kid has manuscript. So doing my checks asking about food and home environment. Mother tells, though little kid is lactose intolerant, so we only ask almond milk. Run a panel. Not only is the poor little 2-year-old not lactose tolerant, dumbass mother has been starving his poor brain of nutrients by feeding him only vegetables, but no protein or protein-based items like legumes. Kid is developmental delayed because she saw an internet article on it. Ended up calling CPS on the beach and having all of her 3 children removed. Had a daughter with bulimia. It was horrifying. Still pisses me off when I think it about. I'm not a doctor, but when I went to see a physician a year back for my shaking problem, I have severely shaking hands. I was told that it was a short-term problem that would likely go away in my late 20s. I told him I was on medication, and he dismissed it as an unrelated issue. Recently, I went to a different doctor. He assessed my symptoms: jolting limbs, twitchy face, shaking hands, locking jaw, etc. Turns out I have tardive dyskinesia, which is a very rare side effect of one of the medications I was on. It is irreversible after age 25. If I had listened to the first doctor, I would have permanent brain damage as young as 25 years old. Edit. Fixed spelling.
N.
Not a self-diagnosis, but I had been seeing various doctors for months with what they thought was post-viral syndrome or depression, depending on how the doctor felt that day. Then after being out in the sun one day, I developed a malar rash, and my husband decided it looked like something he had seen on a medical program called lupus. Doctors laughed me and him out of the consultation room for months. I was too young, not the right race, no family history, etc. etc. Turns out they decided eventually to order the right blood tests and I have lupus. I do love doctors, but realize now that often their guess is as good as mine.